The words were delivered with the casual cruelty of a queen swatting a fly. "You are not even worth the price of my child's diaper." I froze, my hand still cradling my granddaughter's tiny, powdered bottom. In that moment, in the opulent, wood-paneled living room of the Boston brownstone I had bought with my own blood and savings, I became a ghost. My daughter-in-law, Simone, didn't even look at me as she spoke, her attention fixed on a guest admiring her antique silver. "Finish that and then you can go to your room. This is a home, not a hospice." The air in the room, once warm with the scent of roasted duck and expensive wine, turned sharp and cold. A dozen pairs of eyes, belonging to my son Alistair's colleagues and Simone's society friends, flickered towards me and then quickly away. I was a stain on their perfect evening, a piece of unpleasantness to be ignored. I lowered my gaze, the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck. My granddaughter, Celeste, a child whose face I had just kissed, looked up at me and whispered a perfect, chilling mimicry of her mother's tone. "You're not real family, are you, Genevieve?" I was not a grandmother. I was Genevieve, an employee, an object, the memories I carried of teaching Alistair to ride a bicycle on these same cobblestone streets, of nursing him through scarlet fever, of pouring my life savings into this very house so he and Simone could have a prestigious address. All of it evaporated into nothing. I retreated from the room, the diaper barely fastened, my movements slow and deliberate. As the heavy oak door clicked softly shut behind me, I heard the ripple of polite, relieved laughter rise once more. Tears did not come. In the cavernous, silent kitchen, I poured a cup of tea I had made for myself hours ago, now cold. I lit a single slender candle and placed it beside a very small cupcake I had baked that morning. It was vanilla, with a single perfect swirl of buttercream, just enough for one. I set it on the small bistro table in the corner, next to a silver-framed photograph of my late husband, his eyes crinkling in a smile that still warmed me. From a vase, I pulled the last fading damask rose from an arrangement he had sent me on our final anniversary and laid it beside the cake. The candle flame flickered, a tiny, defiant spear of light in the encroaching darkness. I closed my eyes and made a wish, not for forgiveness or revenge, but for something far more fundamental: acknowledgement. I took a slow, deep breath, and the scent of vanilla and wilting rose filled my lungs. I thought of the years I had given, a life of service exchanged for a life of servitude, and in that profound hush, a thought, cold and clear as ice, settled in my soul. They don't know. They have no idea that one phone call is all it would take. The thought wasn't bitter. It was a fact, as solid and real as the granite foundation of the house. I had arranged everything months ago, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when they were at their country club, assuming I was too old, too frail, too senile to understand the intricacies of trusts and titles. My name, Genevieve Dubois, was the only one on the deed. My investments, carefully managed for 50 years, were untouched, and my lawyer, the formidable Mr. Abernathy, was waiting for my signal. They had called me a burden, an unpaid babysitter, a ghost at their feast. As I stared at the flickering candle, I allowed myself a small, fierce, secret smile. I blew it out, a delicate puff of air, and watched the darkness rush in to reclaim the room. Tonight, they believed I was invisible. Tomorrow, they would learn I was invincible. The weight of the metal was a phantom limb against my chest, a ghost of memory from a lifetime ago. I had earned it under the screaming glare of surgical lights in a MASH unit just south of the 38th parallel. As Major Dubois, head nurse, I orchestrated triage in a canvas tent that smelled of blood, antiseptic, and fear. I was the one who decided who lived, who died, who had a fighting chance. My hands, steady and sure, stitched wounds, administered morphine, and held the hands of boys who cried out for their mothers with their last breaths. I was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, an honor I accepted in a quiet ceremony and then packed away in a cedar box. I never spoke of it to Alistair. When he was born, I traded the chaos of the battlefield for the sacred quiet of his nursery. I left a career where my word was law, where my competence was the thin line between life and death. I gave it all up for scraped knees, science fair projects, and the soft weight of his head on my shoulder as I read him to sleep. I never once regretted it. But now, as I knelt on Simone's imported Persian rug, the words they threw at me were more painful than any shrapnel. "You left your career because you weren't ambitious enough," Alistair had said last week, his tone casual as he scrolled through his phone. "You never really built anything of your own." Simone, applying lipstick in the hallway mirror, had added without turning, "Darling, if she were truly that capable, she'd have her own place. She wouldn't be living in our guest room." The cruelty of their indifference was a slow-acting poison. They measured my worth in present utility, erasing the past as if it were a fiction. My legacy, the very foundation of their comfortable lives, was invisible to them. They saw a stooped old woman, useful for childcare and light housekeeping, not the decorated officer who had commanded a platoon of nurses through the crucible of war. The irony was so perverse it was almost elegant. The woman who had saved hundreds was now considered a liability by the one life she had chosen to create. They never asked what it cost me. The promotions I declined, the colleagues I lost touch with, the intellectual rigor I missed. They walked past the framed photograph on my nightstand, a black and white image of me, young and formidable in my uniform, without a second glance. It was just a picture of an old woman they didn't really know. The silence they imposed upon me became my new uniform. I learned to navigate their world by making myself smaller, quieter, less present. I learned that my history was an inconvenience, a story they didn't want to hear. So I leaned into the silence. But I never forgot who I was. The same steady hands that had once clamped an artery now folded Celeste's tiny onesies. The same authoritative voice that had once directed medics now whispered fairy tales. I adapted. I endured. But most importantly, I planned, because when they erased my past, they made me dangerously resolved to secure my future. In the quiet moments, while they were out at galas and fundraisers, I was meeting with Mr. Abernathy. I was reading the fine print. I was building a fortress around my assets, a fortress they didn't even know existed. They saw a smiling, compliant grandmother in a floral apron. They had no idea that behind the smile was a mind forged in battle, and she was preparing for one last campaign. Every morning, I rose before the sun, my movements a silent ballet of domesticity. I would brew their favorite dark roast coffee, arrange the morning papers, and ensure the historic brownstone was immaculate before they descended from their master suite. I was the invisible engine that kept their perfect lives running. I existed in the background, a part of the scenery, like the antique grandfather clock in the hall, present but unheard. They never sought my opinion, only my labor. At a lavish party celebrating Simone's promotion at her art gallery, guests mingled, champagne flutes chimed, and I was asked to pass hors d'oeuvres. A man, a trustee of some museum, looked from me to Alistair. "Is this your housekeeper?" he asked, not unkindly. Alistair, the son I had taught to read, the boy whose dreams I had funded, gave a tight, awkward laugh. Simone glided over, her smile a slash of red lipstick. "Oh, that's just his mother," she said, her voice light and dismissive. "Her wardrobe is a bit eccentric." She steered the trustee away, leaving me standing alone with a tray of smoked salmon canapés and the scalding shame of their denial. It was in that moment that something within me calcified. For years I had accepted their narrative, had allowed them to shrink me into a role that suited their needs. I had worn muted colors, stayed out of family portraits, and timed my entrances and exits to cause the least disruption. I had become an expert at taking up less space. But their casual erasure in front of a stranger was a different kind of wound. It wasn't just neglect. It was a public declaration of my worthlessness. I now sit in the small alcove off the main hall, just out of sight of the living room where their laughter echoes. I can hear the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation. They are celebrating Alistair's latest venture, a tech startup he's funding by leveraging the value of this house. This house. The thought is no longer painful. It is a point of focus, a lodestar. In a locked drawer in my room, hidden behind my old nursing journals, are the papers, the deed, bearing only my name, the documents from the bank outlining the reverse mortgage I took out years ago to fund Simone's first gallery, a loan I paid off with my own pension, and the carefully worded codicil Mr. Abernathy had drafted, a beautiful piece of legal scripture stating that upon any attempt to sell, transfer, or leverage the property without my express notarized consent, all ownership and equity would be subject to immediate and irreversible seizure. They assumed my silence was submission. They were about to learn that it was strategy. They mistook my patience for powerlessness. They would soon discover it was the prelude to justice. The invisible work I had performed for years was not lost. It had been accumulating, like interest in a forgotten account. And the hour was fast approaching when the balance would come due. I would not be a ghost in my own home. I would be its foundation, the bedrock they had forgotten they were standing on. And when the earth began to shake, they would have no one to blame but themselves. The first move was a story. At Sunday dinner, I sat beside Celeste, helping her cut her roast chicken. I began to speak, my voice quiet but clear, weaving a tale from my past. In the field hospital, in the dead of winter, I began. A young soldier was brought in, no older than my Alistair was then. His leg was... Simone cut me off sharply, her fork clattering against her plate. Mother, please. No one wants to hear morbid war stories at the table. This is a family meal. She raised her wine glass, a silent toast to my silencing. I set my own fork down. The polished silver felt cold and heavy. I looked at my son, but he refused to meet my gaze. I excused myself from the table. The message was clear. My past had no place here. My history was irrelevant. In my room, behind a stack of antique medical textbooks, I pulled out the gray legal folder. I had allowed them to reduce me for long enough. The woman who had faced down death would not be defeated by dinner party etiquette. I took the deed, the mortgage records, and the letter from Mr. Abernathy and tucked them into my handbag with the same purpose I had once packed a surgical kit. The next day, while Simone was at yoga and Alistair was at a board meeting, I took a taxi to the downtown offices of Abernathy, Finch, and Thorne. Mr. Abernathy, now a venerable man with eyes that had seen a century of Boston's secrets, greeted me with a warm, respectful smile. Genevieve, he said, I've been waiting for your call. We spent 2 hours fortifying my position. We filed quiet addendums with the city registrar. We placed alerts with the bank's fraud department, flagging any inquiry related to the property's title. We crafted a beautiful, ironclad legal document that I came to think of as silent guardianship. It was my survival. A week later, I was arranging flowers in the hall when I overheard Alistair on the phone, pacing in his study. Yeah, we'll flip the brownstone next quarter. The valuation is through the roof. My mother, she's a non-issue. We'll just move the paperwork through. She won't know the difference. I calmly snipped the stem of a rose and placed it in the vase. Then I went to my room, took a copy of the newly fortified deed, and placed it in an envelope labeled contingency. The moment of truth arrived not with a bang, but with a series of confused, frustrated phone calls. Alistair's ambitious plan to sell the house to fund his startup hit an invisible wall. His lawyers were stymied. The bank was uncooperative. The real estate agents were baffled. There was a legal snag, a title complication, an unforeseen ownership issue. I watched him from a distance, folding laundry, humming a lullaby, as the smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a pallor of panic. I heard my name whispered behind closed doors, no longer with dismissal, but with dawning suspicion. It has to be her. How could she? What kind of mother would do this? He finally confronted me, not with anger, but with a desperate, trembling confusion. He called a family meeting at the grand mahogany dining table. "We need to talk about what's happening with the house," he began, his voice strained. "There seems to be some confusion about who legally owns it." His eyes met mine across the polished wood. I didn't fade into the background. I sat up straight, placed my linen napkin on my lap, and spoke into the tense silence. "There is no confusion, Alistair," I said, my voice as calm and steady as it had been in the operating theater. "I do." Silence. A profound, echoing silence broken only by Simone's sharp intake of breath. I then laid out the facts one by one, with surgical precision: the original deed, the reverse mortgage I had personally satisfied, the addendums filed 2 months prior, the fraud alerts, the legal counsel of Mr. Abernathy. I presented the truth not as an accusation, but as an unalterable fact. They stared, their faces a collage of disbelief and horror. The fortress of their arrogance, built on the assumption of my weakness, crumbled into dust before their eyes. Alistair's face went white. Simone looked as though she might faint. I watched them break, not with glee, but with the quiet, somber satisfaction of a battle won through strategy, not brute force. I had not sought revenge. I had merely reclaimed what was mine. I stood, leaving the notarized deed sitting in the center of the table like a tombstone for their ambitions. As I walked from the room, no one spoke. There was only the sound of their world falling apart in stunned, terrified silence. Later that night, I heard my son on the phone again, his voice broken. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I misunderstood. Everything." The words were not for me, but I heard them. And I knew that justice, when delivered quietly, carries a weight that no argument can move. The invitation was a handwritten note on my finest cream-colored stationery left on the hall table: family dinner, Sunday, 6 p.m., sharp. They came, their movements stiff, their smiles brittle. They sat at the long dining table, the air thick with unspoken fear. They knew this was a sentencing. After the main course was cleared, I stood. "I have invited you here tonight," I began, my voice even. "Not to cause pain, but to restore balance. I am not here to humiliate anyone, but I will no longer protect those who have forgotten how to offer respect." I placed the deed on the table. It lay there, crisp and final. I am the sole legal owner of this house. This is not open for discussion. Alistair's hands shook. Simone stared at her lap. "I am disappointed," I continued, looking directly at my son. "Not in your ambition, but in your memory. You reduced me to a function, a convenience. You forgot the woman who raised you, who served her country, who built the foundation you so carelessly took for granted. When I stopped being useful to your ambitions, you stopped seeing me at all." He blinked, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. "But I do not hate you," I said, and the truth of it surprised me. The anger had burned away, leaving something clean and hard in its place. "I don't seek revenge. I seek respect. And now that the law is on my side, so shall be this family." He broke then, not with a loud theatrical wail, but with silent, racking sobs. The sound of a man realizing the world he had built was a house of cards. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply wept. "I will not evict you," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But my status in this house has changed. From this day forward, I am not your servant. I am not your babysitter. I am the matriarch and the homeowner. I will be treated with dignity, or I will live here alone." The choice of whether you stay under these new terms is yours." After dinner, as the other relatives shuffled out in a haze of shock, Alistair remained. He slowly folded the deed and handed it back to me. "You're right, Mother," he whispered. For now, it was enough. The following morning, I began to pack, not with anger, but with a sense of profound liberation. I took my books, my photographs, my journals, and my mother's china. I was not being exiled. I was emigrating to a country of my own making. I moved to a sun-drenched apartment in Cambridge, overlooking a quiet square filled with oak trees. It was small, but it was entirely mine. For the first time in years, I woke not to the demands of others, but to the gentle rhythm of my own desires. I drank my coffee black, read the paper from cover to cover, and took long walks along the Charles River. I rejoined a book club. I attended lectures at the university. I was no longer a function. I was a person. I was Genevieve. A letter arrived, penned in Alistair's shaky script. An apology, raw and full of remorse. He asked for permission to visit. I thought for a long time before writing back. "I'm living my life by choice now, not by obligation," I wrote. "When you have learned to listen without agenda, you will be welcome here. My peace is not negotiable. To anyone listening who has felt their light dimmed by the shadow of another's expectations, who has been made to feel like a guest in their own life, hear this. Your presence is not a privilege you grant to others. It is your birthright. You do not have to scream to reclaim your space. Sometimes, the most powerful statement is the quiet act of locking a door and opening a window. It was never about the house. It was about the home I had to rebuild within myself. And that home is finally, unequivocally, mine.